Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Harvard Classics lectures. This is our continuation of the Harvard Classics lectures for volume number 4. This is lecture number 22, where we will be investigating Paradise Lost Book 8. Now again, as we've said before, I definitely recommend that you're working with LearnStrong.net, especially going back and looking at lectures 19, 20, 21. That is to say, Raphael's speech, the middle part of Paradise Lost, just so you have a sense of what's going on. Book 8 will finish that dialogue between Adam, primarily Adam. Eve is silent through almost all of it. Eve, not even hardly mentioned. She'll be mentioned briefly in Book 8. In some ways, put this in your notes, it's a 3-year observation, and we'll make it early, but in some ways, you understand this dialogue, this back and forth, this exchange, a whole lot better if, for example, you understand Plato's dialogues, as we've talked about them many times. And I'm going to make the argument, go ahead and write it down, we'll come back to it, that Plato's Symposium is probably as important for this Book 8 as any other one of the Platonic dialogues, where, of course, you will have an exchange that is ultimately a what? Propedeutic. We've used the term before. That is to say, it's didactic, it's instructional. You're supposed to learn something. Now, of course, in Book 4, we will meet the very important discussion of the patriarchy. We went through this in Lecture 18, and I definitely recommend, if you haven't seen those comments, go back and look at those comments. Because in Book 8, ironically, Book 8 is the doubling of Book 4. In Book 8, we have the double down, many have argued, of the arguments for the patriarchy. Book 8, in many ways, reminds us of why we both love and hate Milton, right, as modern readers. Book 7, we might argue as the Magnificent Seven, to use now terms from cowboy movies, or we might say Western films. Magnificent Seven, the creation song, the creation hymn, beautiful poetry. And in Book 8, sometimes referred to as the Hateful Eight, because we'll have here a reminder of how Milton is going to try to impose some justification for the idea that men should be superior to women, especially in regards to some kind of relational understanding. Now, let's remind ourselves that we are working with 3 levels of reading. What does the text say? What does the text mean? And how do we relate to the text? And we're also looking at Paradise Lost from 3 perspectives: as epic. For example, the great speeches will remind us of any number of texts, including Beowulf and, of course, Homer's Iliad, Odyssey, and Virgil's Aeneid. We'll talk about the philosophic or theological renderings here. For example, in this book, we're going to come back again to this question of the dangers of knowledge, wanting to know too much. And then, of course, the political understandings of both psychological and sociological perspectives. The critique of the patriarchy, we're going to be back to it again. Are men and women really different fundamentally? And we'll ask at 3B whether you see that or not. Of course, we have Adam's discussion and back and forth with God, and there's some interesting kind of psychological renderings there. And then, of course, from the sociological model, what do you see as being similarities and differences between Adam and Eve and their telling of their birth story? Let's jump now to level 1 quickly, and let's read, as we have done for all of our previous books, the argument of Book 8. Adam inquires concerning celestial motions, that is to say, the movement of the stars, the heavens, is doubtfully answered and exhorted to search, rather, things more worthy of knowledge. In other words, Raphael's going to give him a warning. Adam assents and, still desirous to detain Raphael, relates to him what he remembered since his own creation, his placing in paradise, his talk with God concerning solitude in fit society, his first meeting and nuptials with Eve, his discourse with the angel Thereupon, who, after admonitions repeated, departs. Now let's do a quick kind of outlining of the plot. 1. Adam is going to ask about astronomy, and this is Milton's opportunity. Remember, Milton, who had met Galileo, to kind of have this argument or exchange about what is the right way to understand the placement of the earth in regards to the rest of the universe. The Ptolemaic view, the earth-centered view. The Copernican view, the solar heliocentered view. And at part 1, Adam's going to ask this question of Raphael, and Raphael's fundamentally going to say, don't ask. Before, however, this exchange really gets going, Eve has had enough, I guess, listening to these two talk, and she gets up and leaves and goes and tends her flowers. She will have a hope that Adam later can give her the high points while he's giving her a few kisses. We'll get into this whole idea about why Eve would think it's necessary to leave. Adam is then in the second part of this book. He's going to provide a flashback to his own creation. Raphael wasn't around at the time, and so Raphael's interested as well. And we're going to ask, how does Adam's understanding of the creation birth story somehow differ from the one that we got from Eve, mentions both in book 4 as well as in book 5? And we have this interesting dialogue between Adam and God, and then ultimately leading to Eve's creation. That's the middle part of book 8. And then finally, we have a warning that we're going to see when Adam speaks about how unbelievably, stunningly beautiful, physically beautiful Eve is to him. Raphael's going to be a little bit concerned about this. Now, of course, when Eve gets up to leave, we cannot help but think of those stories, for example, about Virginia Woolf, who said she loved to sit with the Bloomsburg group, all those men, and in the late afternoon. But when it came time for them to have their tea, they would all turn and look at her. It was her job to get up and to go and make the tea. And she writes in several different places about how frustrating this was, that the men expected her to play certain roles, and then she was in there making tea while they were continuing their philosophic conversations, and how frustrated she was by this. We're gonna obviously see some of this here. Well, let's go to it right away. The first 20 lines open with a request. Adam will ask the angel, "What thanks sufficient, or what recompense equal have I to render thee, divine historian, who thus largely hast allayed the thirst I had of knowledge, and vouchsafed this friendly condensation to relay things else by me unsearchable?" In other words, thank you very much. He calls him a historian, giving information of the past. "Now heard with wonder but delight, and as is due, with glory attributed to the high Creator. Something yet of doubt remains." So Adam is going to continue and say, "Yeah, I got one more question. Which only thy solution can resolve when I behold this goodly frame, this world." And this will remind us, of course, of Hamlet speaking with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, of course, when he says, man delights not me, at the conclusion of that speech. "Of heaven and earth consisting, and compute their magnitudes, this earth, a spot, a grain, an atom, with the firmament compared, and all her numbered stars that seem to rouse spacious, incomprehensible." In other words, Adam says, I want to know more about the way the world works. This amazing universe. Can you please help me out? Explain the universe to me. At line 40, we're told that Eve decides to leave. She retired in sight, with loneliness majestic from her seat, and grace that one who saw to wish her stay, rose and went forth among her fruits and flowers to visit how they prospered, bud and bloom, her nursery. They at her coming sprung, and touched by her fair tendrance, gladlier grew. Yet when she is not with such discourse delighted, or not capable or ear of what was high, such pleasure she reserved, Adam relating, she sole adroitous. Her husband, the relater, she preferred before the angel, and of him to ask chose rather. He, she knew, would intermix grateful digressions and solve high dispute with conjugal caresses. Now, there's been a lot made of this, and we'll just point it out here that the suggestion is Eve could probably handle this conversation, but when it gets to the things about the stars, she says, you know what, I'm just going to go take care of the plants, and Adam will give me the high points later, as he's also giving me kisses. Notice, for your notes, there's already this injection of the idea that Eve represents somehow a certain kind of sexuality, sensuality, which is going to be perceived as very dangerous. We're going to get to that here later. At line 66, Raphael will actually just come out and tell Adam, "To ask or search I blame thee not. For heaven is the book of God before thee set, wherein to read his wondrous works, and learn his seasons, hours, or days, or months, or years. This to attain, whether heaven move, or earth imports not, if thou reckon right." He says it is not necessary that one would be concerned with answering these kinds of questions. In the end, don't ask. At line 122, "What if the sun be centered of the world, and other stars be his attractive virtue, and their own incited dance about him various rounds?" In other words, don't worry about this kind of question. It is not necessary for you to worry about this kinds of questions. He says it's not of greatest concern. By line 167 or so, he says it. "Solicit not thy thoughts with matters hid. Leave them to God above. Him serve in fear. Of other creatures as him pleases best. Whether placed, let him dispose. Joy thou in what he gives to thee this paradise, and thy fair Eve. Heaven is for thee too high to know what passes there. Be lowly wise. Think only what concerns thee and thy being. Dream not of other worlds, what creatures there live, in what state, condition, or degree, contented that thus far hath been revealed, not of earth only, but of highest heaven. Ending around line 178. Now, of course, this is interesting, dream not of other worlds, because you'll remember that it's Milton who in the opening invocation in Book 1 said that his aspiration was to attempt things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme. But notice here it's don't try to do too much. Don't try to go for too much knowledge. Adam, starting at line 179 to 197, will agree. His comment is interesting. How fully hast thou satisfied me, pure intelligence of heaven, angels serene, and free from intricacies, taught to live the easiest way, nor with perplexing thoughts to interrupt the sweet of life, from which God hath bid dwell far off all anxious cares, and not molest us unless we ourselves seek them with wandering thoughts and notions vain. Knowledge and the desire for knowledge can be dangerous, but apt the mind or fancy is to rove unchecked, and of her roving is no end, till, warned or by experience taught, she learned that not to know at large of things remote from use, obscure and subtle, but to know that which before us lies in daily life is the prime wisdom, which is what is more is fume, or emptiness. This word fume, by the way, takes us back to Book 7, line 126 to 130, this notion about farting again. It's a funny joke. Fume of emptiness, or fond impertinence, and renders us in things that most concern unpracticed, unprepared, and still to seek, therefore, from this high pitch, let us descend a lower flight. In other words, Adam says, I totally agree with you. It is dangerous to not to want to search for knowledge that one should not know. Now again, this is remarkable given that Milton met Galileo. And think about what is about to transpire with Newton's Principia Mathematica and of course the beginning of what we call the scientific enlightenment. It's quite a remarkable moment, isn't it? Adam then, starting at line 205, will begin to tell the story of his birth, his creation. And Raphael will say at line 217, yeah, I'd really like to hear this because I was actually on a mission that day and I was unable to be there when you were created. I'd like to, he was off actually in hell. He says, I'd really like to hear what went down there. Starting at line 250, it is the beginning then of this idea of how it all worked in terms of Adam's birth, right, creation. For man to tell how human life began is hard, starting at line 250. For who himself beginning knew, desire with thee still longer to converse induced me. As new waked from soundest sleep, soft on the flowery herb, I found me laid in balmy sweat, which with his beams the sun soon dried, and on the reeking moisture fed. Interesting, let's just point out for your notes. I would recommend that you write this down. The ways in which the two different perceptions by Adam and by Eve of their birth narratives. Adam, for example, will be born in sunshine, sweating. Eve, you'll remember, under the plantain leaf in the shade. And of course, a lot has been said about the differences between the two of these. I turned and gazed a while the ample sky till, raised by quick instinctive motion, up I sprang. So as soon as he wakes up from being created, he looks up, he sees the sky, then he jumps up. As thitherward endeavoring and upright, stood on my feet. Again, Milton has made a big deal about the fact that humans walk upright. About me round I saw hill, dale, and shady woods, and sunny plains, and liquid laps of murmuring streams, by these creatures that lived, and moved, and walked or flew, birds on the branches warbling, all things smiled. We're back to, of course, the last book with the joy of creation. With fragrance and with joy, there's the word, my heart overflowed. Myself I then perused. In other words, he says, I looked at myself, and limb by limb, surveyed and sometimes went and sometimes ran, with subtle joints as lively vigor led. But who I was, or where, or from what cause, knew not. I didn't know who I was. Why am I here? To speak, I tried, and forthwith spake. Again, we ask, what language? Milton never plays that game. My tongue obeyed, and readily could name whatever I saw. In other words, he's born with a certain understanding of language and with knowledge. Thou, sun, said I, fair light, and thou enlightened earth, so fresh and gay, ye hills and dales, ye rivers, woods, and plains, and ye that live and move, fair creatures, tell Tell if you saw, how came I thus? How here? And then he says it, not of myself, but by some great maker then, in goodness and in power preeminent. Tell me, how may I know him? How adore, from whom I have, that thus I move and live. We think of the Acts 17:28 verse when Paul is there on the Acropolis. And feel that I am happier than I know. Now, let's just point out, Adam says, the moment I woke up, I looked at myself and said, I could not have made myself. Therefore, there must be a designer. This is, of course, what St. Augustine will call, and of course, Thomas Aquinas will call, argument from design. One of the great arguments for the existence of deity is the physical body and the world around us. Where did it all come from? Couldn't have come accidentally. There had to be some kind of designer. Ergo, he says, I knew immediately there was a God. The naming of the animals, I'm sorry, let's go to 3:19 really quickly. This God speaks to Adam directly, as opposed to Eve as only a voice. And he says, this paradise I give thee, count it thine, to till and keep, and of the fruit to eat, of every tree that in the garden grows. Eat freely with glad heart, fear here no dearth. But of the tree whose operation brings knowledge of good and ill, which I have set the pledge of thy obedience and of thy faith, amid the garden by the tree of life, remember what I warned thee, shun to taste, and shun the bitter consequence. For know, the day thou eatest thereof, my sole command transgressed, inevitably thou shalt die. From that day mortal, and this happy state, thou shalt lose, expelled, why we call it paradise lost, yes, from hence into a world of woe. We go back to the opening words of the invocation of the Muse, and sorrow. So in other words, we're told right away, the admonition is given, whatever you do, don't mess around with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, interestingly, we're back to that notion of don't want to know too much. At line 343, we're told that Adam is to name the animals. At line 350, we're told that they come in front of him 2 by 2. Now, let's point out that Milton says that the names of the animals actually are already in Adam's mind. That is to say, God has planted them there so that the names are all appropriate. Of course, 2 by 2 immediately makes us think about Noah and the flood that will be coming in the Genesis account later. At line 355, Adam says it. Something is missing. Now, of course, we already read in an earlier lecture, the Genesis 2 account, where Adam looks around and names all the animals, but does not see his equal, and therefore wants to have a partner, right? Now, at 356, we have an amazing dialogue that will begin between God and Adam, and we begin to realize that God is kind of playing a little bit of a dialogue game back and forth with Adam as we begin. At line 369, God will say, when Adam asks for a pal, God will say, what are you talking about? Why callest thou solitude? Is not the earth with various living creatures in the air replenished, and all these at thy command to come and play before thee? In other words, you have the animals, you're fine. At line 379 and 388, Adam will respond and he says, I want fellowship. I need a fellowship, I speak, at line 388. And then at 398, God says, well, I am always alone. I am always solitary. What thinkest thou then of me in this my state? Seem I to thee sufficiently possessed of happiness, or not, who am alone from all eternity? For none I know second to me or like, equal much less. How have I then with whom to hold converse, save with the creatures which I have, and those to me inferior, infinite descents beneath? What other creatures are there to thee? In other words, he says, well, look at me. I mean, I don't have any equal, and yet I'm able to survive. Line 412, Adam will basically say it out loud. Yeah, you're perfect, and I am not. And at line 429, he says, you don't need social communication, and I really do. At line 436, then, God will say back to Adam, and we see that this has all been kind of a test. Thus far to try thee, Adam, I was pleased and find thee, knowing not of beasts alone, which thou hast rightly named, but of thyself expressing well. The spirit within thee free, my image not imparted to the brute. In other words, God will say it. You are absolutely right. He says it in line 447. I, ere thou spakest, knew it not good for man to be alone, quoting, of course, the Genesis 2 account. And no such company as then thou sawest intended thee for trial, only brought to see how thou couldst judge or fit and meet. What next I bring shall please thee, be assured. thy likeness, thy fit help, thy other self, thy wish exactly to thy heart's desire. Now this other self, again, we're going to jot down. You'll remember that when we did Plato's Symposium, there's that myth in Plato's Symposium that before birth you are a perfect sphere. Your soul is cut in half. Half of that soul goes into you. Half of that soul goes into someone else. And then like two magnets, you are forever trying to find through laws of attraction the other that is your soul mate. To quote the old Tom Cruise film, Jerry Maguire, you complete me. Already we're playing this game with Milton as well. So God is testing Adam, and then he says it, I will create then Eve for you. Now the creation of Eve will begin at line 452. By 465 we're told that it's the left side of Adam where the rib is taken. And then at lines 488 we're told about her, because Adam is totally blown away when he sees her. Grace was in her steps, heaven in her eye. And then at line 491 he says, thank you to God, and he names her woman, just like in the Genesis 2 account. At line 507, we have something interesting. Eve turns away. Now, of course, we've been told through Eve's account why this is the case, because she got up, she went and looked at how beautiful she was in the pond, in the lake, in the water, and she didn't want to leave her beauty, but then she was told through a voice, God speaks to her through a voice, no, you are created for man. Adam then finally will finish his story at line 520, and then at line 530, he'll begin to speak about Adam, about Eve, and the beautiful passion that is erected, or that's always coming up because of Eve's beauty. He even says it. Here he says, it makes me weak. And here he says, nature failed me, starting at line 530, 533, and following. And by 546, yet when I approach her loveliness, Eve's loveliness, so absolute she seems, and in herself complete, so well to know her own, that what she wills to do or say seems wisest, virtuousest, discreetest, best, all higher